Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. Hello, everybody. It's the 10th of January, 2026. Thomas Jefferson Day in the United States. I'm half joking, of course. I don't think there's any particular association of 10th of January with Thomas Jefferson, although every day it seems in America is Thomas Jefferson Day, or at least every day there's something else about Jefferson, the symbol of America, of all its contradictions, its ironies, his hypocrisies. And my guest today has a new book out. There are many books on Thomas Jefferson, and he's written, in fact, many of them. Andrew Burstein, new book, Being Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History, is out next week. And Andrew is joining us from his home in, yeah, you guessed it, Charlottesville, Virginia, where the great Jefferson lived at Monticello. Andrew, congratulations, Andy, on the new book. I have to ask you, I mean, it's the standard question. Do we really need another book on Thomas Jefferson? Don't we know absolutely everything about the guy?
We certainly don't. And there's some good reasons for that. I'm very critical of, I wouldn't have, at this stage in my career, I would not have authored another book on Jefferson, particularly not an intimate history, unless things had changed in the field. And there have been many Jefferson scholars. I've read so many biographies that are either hit pieces or that lionize him. What I do as a cultural historian, and what intimate history actually entails, is to go deep into the archive and look at the language of sensation. I mean, what made Jefferson, what made him iconic, and the reason why Americans quote Jefferson, look to Jefferson on an emotional level, is because he wrote with a musical cadence, poetically, at a time when most writers, certainly political writers, had a less open, they did not understand what he did about seducing the reader. And I use that word intentionally because that's what I've uncovered here. He applied that talent both in his famous political statements, such as the Declaration of Independence, his first inaugural address, which are beautiful works, which are emotionally laden works, and getting inside the mind and the heart of Jefferson is, and I'll give you another example. I associate him with the concept of American exceptionalism, that the emotionally driven language that he used, the seductive language that he used, was to establish America's moral superiority over the old world. And, in a way that pertains to conversations going on today, as far as how far America has fallen in the eyes of the world, and how the old world, the Europeans, have seemed to have adopted a more optimistic Jeffersonian approach to society. And America has become more socially conservative, less progressive.
So if what you're arguing in Being Thomas Jefferson, that most people have missed the fact that Jefferson is an intellectual seducer, that he's in the business of getting his reader to fall in love with him or to do what he wants them to do with him, doesn't that make him very much of a late 18th, early 19th century European writer? I mean, there's nothing particularly original about that. Ever since anyone's ever picked up a pen, they've been in the business of seducing their reader.
That's a great question. The way I would answer it is that Americans at the time of the Revolution were reading exclusively European authored novels, poetry, and they found the beauty in the language of the English poets. And this is even before the Romantic age kicks in the early 19th century, as well as the common law. I mean, America's reference point was England, predominantly England, France. And so it's what makes Jefferson's language special in this regard is that because novels did not have they were more prescriptive, and history was certainly prescriptive. What Jefferson did was to let, for example, this is 2 years before the Declaration of Independence, when no one in America was insulting the king, and he writes in the summary view of the rights of British America, which is the document that it found its way to London and the document that the Continental Congress read, and probably the reason why he was selected to write the Declaration. It wasn't just his legal expertise. He writes, to the king, open your breast, sire, to liberal and expanded thought. I mean, that sounds like, vintage Enlightenment language. But he goes on to say, the whole art of government consists in the art of being honest. Let those who flatter fear. It is not an American art. So you see that he's talking back to the king in a way that's almost colloquial. And what Americans or anyone who's reading 18th century literature, if they can't, aside from the picaresque, aside from the satirical, which the 18th century astoundingly, revels in, and so did Jefferson, most public and private epistolary communication borrowed the beautiful language from the poets, from the novelists, and it wasn't something they were comfortable expressing. And
what about it in terms of, it's a very interesting thesis, Andy. What about in terms of comparing Jefferson with Franklin? We've done some shows on Franklin recently, and now they're the perennial figures of American history that we, for better or worse, are obsessed with. I don't think Franklin can be compared with Jefferson as a writer, but as a person, Franklin went to Europe, and maybe not so much with his pen, but in his persona, he was quite seductive as well in France and England.
Yeah.
Did Jefferson have the same human skills as Franklin, or was all his seductiveness focused or channeled through his pen, through the paper?
Yeah, that's a great point, and something I emphasize in my work. Jefferson was mild-mannered, did not speak much at all in legislative assemblies. This is an age of typography, an age of letter writing, when the written word dominated over speech. This may not be the case in the British Parliament, but in early American history, Jefferson became a national figure, a celebrated, an iconic figure on the basis of what he wrote. This is something that distinguishes the modern day, our visual culture from theirs. Theirs is a 5-mile-an-hour world. And Franklin had his almanac, Poor Richard's Almanac, that made him a millionaire, and for several decades, almost up until the late colonial era, he was known for the axioms, the maxims, fish and visitors stink after 3 days.
It's an interesting point again, Andy. Would we, if we wanted to find a contemporary Jefferson, have to find it in somebody like, I'm not sure how you familiar are with influencers on YouTube, but with characters like Mr. Beast, who get millions of views on YouTube for articulating their wisdom or lack of wisdom on new media? Was Jefferson the influencer of his day?
Franklin was more of an influencer. Jefferson, from the 1790s forward, what Jefferson did, because he was soft-spoken, is he looked for allies. He looked for especially younger men, acolytes, who would do his bidding. He became, in politics, very Machiavellian. And the only better Machiavellian in early American history was Alexander Hamilton, who won the ear of George Washington over Jefferson. But Jefferson's appeal was not Franklin's appeal. Franklin's appeal began on the page, but extended to the lore about him, both as a patriot and as a ladies' man. Jefferson was much more, he liked seclusion. He was obsessed with his privacy. I mean, the creation of Monticello, this retreat on the top of a mountain, he reached out to the world by letter. He communicated with the Enlightenment elites around the world by letter. A lot of these were intentionally, some unwittingly, but most intentionally published in newspapers. So people got to know their heroes on the basis of what they wrote when they read the newspaper. Unlike Franklin, who was clever, Jefferson drew from this language of nervous sensation, where his implicit understanding of the human condition allowed him to move from the Enlightenment school of reason, which was rational, understated, to the Enlightenment school where the nervous language he uses is if the monkish individuals ever felt one generous spasm of the heart, they would forsake forever their.
Yeah, and you've written a book on the inner Jefferson, the outer Jefferson. That this book is being Jefferson, so I guess it's a kind of an inner Jefferson in a different kind of way. How aware was he, in your view, Andy, of what he was doing? Is this just instinctive? He just sort of fell into this kind of, as you suggest, a kind of enlightened romanticism, a self-mytholization, which created this iconic giant in American history. Did he know what he was doing, or he just did what he did and the consequences followed?
He absolutely knew what he was doing. This is what makes him so fascinating, so intriguing. This is a man who, a bibliophile, immense library at home, a political moralist who converted knowledge into feeling. So the political Enlightenment, resonates in Jeffersonian English, even now when we look back on it. He's a uniquely effective writer. I said that only Hamilton was the better Machiavellian. Jefferson knew exactly what he was doing. He chose his friends, he chose his enemies, and he wrote to everyone with this consciousness of what the recipient of his letter, what the reader of his public statement was going to respond to. So that was his genius. I mean, he denies his passion, but it's felt everywhere.
Yeah, and you talk about him in a Machiavellian way, and the only person who out Machiavellied Jefferson was Hamilton, of course. Had a famous musical named after him, although one wonders whether Jefferson's reputation now is perhaps stronger than Hamilton's. It's interesting that you bring up Machiavelli, who himself was a very seductive writer, but whose writing was written in retreat, in failure. He failed in the world, in life, in battle, and then he retreated to his study and wrote the great classics, Prince and the Discourses, which we continue to read today. What's interesting about Jefferson is that he had a successful public life too, and if not a private life, certainly, and we'll come to that later, certainly an inner life. So in contrast with Machiavelli, writing wasn't a retreat for him, was it?
No, it was the lifeblood of his existence. He wrote, well, he was a highly ordered individual who kept a record from 1782 until the end of his life in 1826. It amounts to 656 pages. It's in the Library of Congress. It's called, we call it the Summary Journal of Letters. Every letter sent, received, indexed by the writer or the recipient, this general subject matter, date sent, date received. And he referred back to it constantly when he was writing to some other mover or shaker. So he had this need for control, and it was very effective in maximizing his social and political power. People came to Monticello just for the reason he wanted them there. That he was a self-taught architect, and Monticello was this Palladian Italianate inspired.
Yeah, a remarkable place. I was there last year, although I have to say that given its size in American mythology, one of the things that struck me about going to Monticello was physically how small and cramped he is. But that's another subject. Another character who comes to mind in the way that you're describing the epistolary nature of Jefferson in being Thomas Jefferson. The European that most comes to mind isn't Machiavelli, it's actually Rousseau. How familiar was Jefferson with Rousseau? And would you compare the two in the way in which they use words and language to seduce their reader and try and change the world, and in their romanticism and their romanticization of the self?
That's a great question, and it's one of the puzzles that historians have examined. He does not refer to Rousseau. He does not appear to have collected Rousseau. On the other hand, while he was in France from 1784 to 1789 as the US minister succeeding Benjamin Franklin, he was great friends with those introduced to him by Franklin, the liberal nobility, the philosophers. The one whom I emphasize is Voltaire's literary executor, who was the Marquis de Condorcet. And with Condorcet, Jefferson found they were born the same year. They lost their fathers when young. They were both mathematical prodigies. I'm sure that they discussed.
It's not possible to have lived in Paris in the 1780s or 90s and not know about Rousseau. I mean, it's unimaginable. It's like, I don't know, it's like going to England now and not knowing Shakespeare or something.
Well, but the fact is that Jefferson's peers among the political elite, the American founders, they did not reference Rousseau. They certainly knew Voltaire. They knew him primarily through his plays, but and they knew, English playwrights from the early 18th century. That was their lingua franca, not native-born Americans.
Who was Jefferson? Who did Jefferson publicly or privately acknowledge as his muse? I mean, he and I want to come to this. You've written a fascinating book, another Jefferson book on what you call democracy's muse, how Jefferson himself became both the muse of FDR and Reagan and the Tea Party, probably Trump as well. But who was Jefferson's muse?
That's a good question. I believe that, like everyone else with a college education, he was moved by the social commentary of Joseph Addison, The Spectator, Addison and Steele, again, from the early 18th century, but it lived on and was a part of, the growing up years of any literate colonial American. I think that style of writing, that observational style, the tone of social criticism, those were the kinds of things that influenced Jefferson as an influencer, to use that term again. But Lawrence Stern seems to be,
yeah, I can imagine,
the Tristram Shandy, A Sentimental Journey, the language of feeling. Jefferson was certainly, definitively moved by Stern. And so was John Adams, Abigail Adams. It was part of the way they all communicated, was again by either quoting poets or Shakespeare or someone like Stern, because everybody was in on it. It's like if we would refer to a movie that everybody had seen.
The Godfather, right? Everyone knows the Godfather reference. So you're presenting him as very much of an 18th century figure, as a writer, as a sentimentalist, I guess, in a way, as someone who explored himself and attempted to get into other people. What about his writing on politics? How influenced, for example, would he have been by Burke on the French Revolution? And how did he come to his political views? It's never entirely clear to me what Jefferson's politics are. Perhaps that's one of his attractions. That's what makes him everybody's muse, because ultimately he never clearly had a politics. But who most influenced him politically? Was he familiar with Burke or with the French revolutionaries?
Yes, but when Burke and Thomas Paine went up against each other, Jefferson was firmly on the side of Paine on the French Revolution, and he would have read Burke on The Sublime and Beautiful. He would have understood the philosophical underpinnings. But when it comes to politics, he was a radical. He was more understanding or forgiving of the reign of terror during the French Revolution.
That's his remark about the Tree of Liberty and bloodshed. So was he, in a sense, an admirer or even of Robespierre?
No, not at all, not one bit. It was the liberal nobility, Condorcet, who lost his life during the terror in 1794. Jefferson's other close French friend, Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, sort of a surrogate son to George Washington. Jefferson and the entire Lafayette family were quite close. And so these were the people who Jefferson left France, came back to become Secretary of State under Washington just after the storming of the Bastille, just a few months after that, and expected to come back to France, and that he was there to consult as diplomats even then did. And when the French Revolution, after the Anglo-French War opened in 1793, and the terror kicked in, this put Jefferson in a very difficult position because he was an Anglophobe and a Francophile, and Washington, part of what happened in the Washington administration was that Washington's essential conservatism left him with Hamilton as his chief advisor and Washington's suspicion about the direction of the French Revolution, where I said Jefferson was patient, and sometimes he used hyperbole. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants.
That's more than hyperbole. I mean,
no, it is. Hyperbole was more acceptable. And when we read what Jefferson wrote, it sounds like he's an anarchist. But in the context of his time, and that was written to a friend, it wasn't something that was published in the newspapers then. We have access to 18,000 letters and every scrap of paper he ever left behind. So his reputation has evolved generation by generation, but we have to understand in historical context why a hyperbolic statement written to a trusted friend is not to be interpreted as a recommendation, a policy recommendation, nor it's Jefferson getting something off his chest. So this is one of the problems with some of the biographies that have been written about him. It's that when I said, he's either taken down as an inveterate owner of human property, and justly so. But again, looking in context, he wasn't great. He was unusual, but he shouldn't be singled out for.
No, I take your point, Andy, although some people might think that you're actually having it both ways. On the one hand, you're presenting him as this epistolary figure, someone who lived through his writing, and on the other hand, suggesting you shouldn't always take what he wrote down too seriously because he meant it metaphorically. You've written also, again, I'm sure you're familiar with David Lodge's great book, Changing Places. You're the Morris Zapp, Andy, of Jefferson studies. You've written everything. You wrote a book on Madison and Jefferson as well with Nancy Eisenberg. To what extent was Jefferson an anti-federalist? And can, in political terms, the best way to try and make sense of where he was politically, beyond all the writing and the imagery and the romance, is to present him as an alternative to Madison's federalism?
No. Madison and he were symbiotic, politically speaking, symbiotic. Very often because Jefferson didn't want to put his name forward, didn't want to get his name in the press any more than it already was. Madison, who never seemed to make enemies, unlike Jefferson, would write the newspaper hit piece on Hamilton, for example. No, Madison was bold. Madison had a terrific sense of humor. Americans basically don't understand that relationship, which is why Nancy and I wrote the book. But Jefferson, the Anti-Federalists, we have to back up just a little bit here. The Anti-Federalists began as those who were critical of the Constitutional Convention because, and that included Madison, the one we associate with the Federalist Papers. But the desire for a Bill of Rights, the fear of too strong a central government where ordinary citizens would not have a voice, those were the Anti-Federalists of the late 1780s. Now, Madison, the Federalist, became a Madisonian, Jeffersonian Republican when the first political party in the United States came into being around 1792-93. And the Federalists, they adopted the name the Federalists because Republicans were taken. It could have been either way. Federalist really simply refers to the federative principle, the sharing of power between the states and the central government. It didn't have a more pronounced partisan identity until the defenders of the strong central government, the Hamiltonians, adopted the name Federalist for their what became a political party. It was called a political interest. No one wanted to be a party because party meant faction in the 1780s, 1790s. So the Jeffersonian Republicans, as they became known, which are really, I would say, initially they were the Madisonian Republicans, because Madison was the chief voice of that combined Jefferson-Madison ideology in the Congress. Jefferson, in the executive branch as Secretary of State, was trying his best not to interfere with the separate branch of government, the House and Senate.
Okay, so Madison and Jefferson had a great deal in common intellectually, if not personally. Who then is the un-Jefferson in this remarkable cast of characters at the founding of the Republic? Is it Hamilton? I know you've written a book on the passions of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson comes a bit later. But if we are to create someone who wasn't Thomas Jefferson, your new book is called Being Thomas Jefferson. Maybe we would entitle a new book Not Being Thomas Jefferson. Who would it be?
Well, that's a curious question. I haven't given thought to it before, but at the end of his life, the man who most he was really trying to undermine was a fellow Virginian and actually a distant cousin who wanted to wrest the history of their period from a Jeffersonian perspective and place the Federalists, of which he was one, at the center of what made, dare I say, what made America great. And that was Chief Justice John Marshall, who was Chief Justice. He just became Chief Justice literally a moment before Jefferson took the oath of office as president in 1801. And he was more than a decade younger than Jefferson, and he outlived him. So, Jefferson saw the Supreme Court, and particularly with the all-powerful Marshall, who wrote a multi-volume biography of Washington after Washington's death, utilizing the personal papers of George Washington, leaving Jefferson out as the anti-administration character. And Jefferson was deeply, deeply vengeful toward the Supreme Court Chief Justice. He couldn't budge.
Okay, so, let me rephrase the question. That's an interesting response. What would Jefferson have thought of, not just of Andrew Jackson, of the type of person he was, but of Jacksonian democracy?
Jacksonian democracy, I think he might have felt friendly toward, but Jackson, the man, he did know him. There was minimal correspondence, but Jefferson, when Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams and others in the contested election of 1824, Jefferson made it clear that he considered Andrew Jackson ill-educated and a militaristic, sort of ego-driven, know-nothing, who didn't deserve to be in the executive office. So he was supportive of a Georgian who didn't get close to the White House, who actually had a stroke during the campaign of 1824. And that was Crawford of Georgia, who had been a Treasury Secretary. So Jefferson definitely wanted a Southerner in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, some people might, again, there's sort of the aristocrat from Charlottesville with his magnificent house looking down on the poor Andrew Jackson from a very poor family who fought his way up. Andy, are you suggesting then in this book and in your sort of incredible encyclopedic knowledge of Jefferson, of his ideas, his writing, his work, that he should be best remembered as a performer, a written performer, and that perhaps that's best captured by Declaration of Independence? When one thinks of Madison, of course, one thinks I always think anyway of his remark, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But that's a more sort of conventional political philosophical phrase. Are you suggesting that Jefferson's language is his legacy rather than his ideology?
Yes, I think I would go that far. Jefferson had an inveterate optimism in most all of what he wrote, and he trusted in the educability of ordinary Americans. He felt that opening up the franchise to all white men at a time when there were strict, land holding, property owning provisions in who got to vote. In fact, Andrew Jackson, the so-called, spirit of democracy, he opposed giving, the universal white male franchise. Jefferson believed that the farmer, the small farmer, would receive an effective education without going to college, and just instinctively understood who best represented the interests of that particular community so that they could vote in an election and vote out someone who did not fulfill their obligation to the voter. So he had this optimistic view of the democratic experiment.
So he was a sort of an optimist and a stylist, an orator. He sort of had that oratorical, almost, certainly literary oratorical quality of the 18th century. And is that why, in your view, he's become what you called democracy's muse? Why he can appeal to everybody from FDR to Reagan to the Tea Party?
Yes. In the case of, I think it really was in the New Deal, Roosevelt, when the business, when big business was in charge of America in the 1920s, Roosevelt looked to Jefferson as a way to jumpstart the conversation about returning democracy from the bottom up to the political conversation. Those were dark days for the Democratic Party. What he did with Jefferson is he effectively made Jefferson into a New Deal liberal. And he was inspired by a book that was published in the 1920s about the Jefferson-Hamilton battle, in which it was discussed that you were either a Jeffersonian or a Hamiltonian, and that you could transport those two ideologies into the early decades of the 20th century. And so Roosevelt actually did a book review of this particular book, Jefferson and Hamilton, and he wrote in his book review, the only book review FDR ever wrote, and he wrote in there, "We need a Jefferson. We've got plenty of Hamiltons out there. We need a Jefferson."
It's really interesting, again, thinking out loud here, Andy. FDR, one of FDR's remarkable legacies was his ability to build this unholy alliance of Southern racists and African Americans and Northern liberals and so on and so forth. Do you think one of the reasons he chose Jefferson or chose to champion Jefferson and associate himself with Jeffersonian democracy was that Jefferson himself was able to do that, both as a slave owner in the South, in Virginia, and at the same time, supposedly a liberal and a rebel. So it wasn't perhaps coincidental that a masterful politician like FDR would have chosen Jefferson.
They both came from the upper crust, from families that with long legacies in the country, and there's sort of that noblesse oblige. I mean, Jefferson was the aristocrat as Democrat, And you would say the same thing about Roosevelt. So I think that, the parallels do kind of make sense. And it's easy to see why FDR would be able to extract the beautiful language, that is to say, the humane or humanistic language that Jefferson is best known for. And he was able to extract it and become, again, the champion of the common man. Jefferson was the first so-called man of the people. He cultivated, and this is part of the Machiavellian in him, he cultivated that reputation. And this is why Marshall's take on the founding, that was the dominant take at the end of Jefferson's life, so irritated him, because he cared deeply about how he was to be remembered and what his legacy would be. And he didn't want the Federalist interpretation of the revolution. Jefferson was fine with having Washington as the larger-than-life hero, without whom America would not have become, would not have achieved victory, although it's really the French that gave it to us, but the victory in the Revolutionary War. So credit Washington with that. But Jefferson saw himself as the savior of the Republic, not Washington. He wanted to go down in history. And this is part of his desire for celebrity, is probably the most dynamic element in my interpretation in this book that's never been
right. The person who comes to mind, again, the more you talk about him, the contemporary or more contemporary version of Jefferson would be Bobby Kennedy, who, of course, went to law school at UVA in Charlottesville, so presumably was reasonably popular. Another American aristocrat who attracted both the white working class and African Americans, and also combined all those contradictions, and in a way allowed his brother JFK to be maybe the Washington of the revolution. Fascinating stuff, Andy. Last but not least, we have to, of course, come to the issue that still obsesses us in our age of identity politics. You know the issue. You've written on Madison and Jefferson. You've written on the inner Jefferson. You've written on Jefferson. You wrote a book on Jefferson's secrets. The secret, I'm not sure if he thought of it as a secret, but the secret that most obsesses us is the secret of his association with a slave woman called Sally Hemings, who he owned, who I think was his lover and the mother of some of his children. I don't want to revisit this completely because it's been done to death. But when I visited Monticello last year, I have to admit that the more time I spent there, the more I walked around, it was the ghost of Sally Hemings rather than of Thomas Jefferson that most intrigued me. But maybe that's the way it's been left for visitors. How does the Hemings slavery issue, how does that connect with your analysis in your new book, Being Thomas Jefferson? Do you bring anything new to this, what at least seems to most people, including myself, this absurd contradiction, this hypocrisy between the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the man who turned Sally Hemings into his own concubine?
Yeah, it plays a major role in the overall characterization of the inner Jefferson. First of all, I mean, I could talk for an hour just about this subject.
Maybe we'll do another show on it. Talk for 5 minutes.
First of all, Sally Hemings, he knew from infancy. She was the child of his father-in-law, all right? So Jefferson's wife, Patty, he called her, died after they were married 10 years. They were married in 1772 and she died in 1782. Sally Hemings was Jefferson's wife's half-sister. She was said to be attractive, very attractive, by, one of the testaments comes from an enslaved man who knew his master well and knew Sally Hemings and her family well. I've described the Hemings family as a parallel subordinate family. They were treated special. They were Sally was 3/4 white, 1/4 African American. She was said to appear almost nearly white. And I think we can speculate that there's a fair chance that she in some way resembled her half-sister, his late wife. The question that I examine, I think might interest you, given your recent visit to Monticello and the sense you got from going there about Sally, is that why did Jefferson, who was in debt, who inherited his father-in-law's debt and could never get out of debt, why did he not do what everyone else in his position did and marry a second time to the daughter of another planter? They would marry their fortunes together, and he would have made out well. Instead, for reasons that I get into in the book, his personal sensitivity, his personal need for secrecy, for privacy, and that control element that defines him as the master of this mountain. He chose his wife's half-sister for reasons that I examine. Now, as this pertains to slavery, and Jefferson is a slaveholder, the best thing that we can say about his decision in that regard is not that he emancipated anyone, because only those who were biologically related to him were emancipated at the end of his life, when he was, the equivalent of several $1 million in debt. But he left it to the next generation. He embraced the anti-slavery writings of a number of European and American thinkers. He didn't go up against his Southern peers, his friends, fellow planters, because he didn't take those kinds of chances. So his need for control, combined with his desire to go down in history as well, he doesn't want to get in trouble with posterity. Had he known that his political legacy was going to, which is generally positive, was going to be marred and statues torn down of him because he was a slaveholder, had he known that, I believe he would have done more, at least rhetorically, to speak in favor of the humanity of those who were enslaved. Instead, what he did is double down on his belief, we call it scientific racism, that black and white could not live together, that there was too great a cultural distance, that antagonisms had built up over a few centuries already, and that the humane thing to do was to recolonize emancipated slaves overseas, either or in Haiti, South America, Africa. They would be returned from whence they were kidnapped. And he thought that this would be regarded as the humane, liberal perspective. And for a while it was. But this is why he did not anticipate.
But it's Andy, you deal with this all the time. You sometimes seem to be making excuses for Jefferson, but in your mind, in the mind of Andrew Burstein, this isn't an excuse, is it?
No. It's not the job of the historian to look with favor on a historical character. All I try to do in all of my books is to let the evidence speak for itself, to look in the historical context. What was permissible? Why was it permissible? We don't look to Jefferson's misogyny, right? To the misogyny. the kinds of joke you would see humor published in the newspaper making fun of women and womanhood. Jefferson believed that women had, only nature wanted them in the domestic sphere. He was deeply conservative in this way. And yet Aaron Burr was decidedly a feminist. The Marquis de Condorcet, whose anti-slavery writings Jefferson tried to translate and get published in the United States, like having someone else do the work for him that he wasn't bold enough to do. Condorcet was a feminist. Now, Jefferson could have been more progressive had he imbibed more of the spirit of the French Enlightenment from Condorcet and others he knew. But he, on returning to Virginia in 1790, he became a parochial Virginian again, a defender of the enslavers. And it was because he judged that there were national, political, ideological means of saving the Republic, preserving the Republic, and that took precedence over everything else in his life. It's remarkable among them being slavery. George Washington didn't owe anybody anything. He was rich in land, in slaves. His wife, Martha Washington, her half-sister was a slave who lived on the Mount Vernon plantation. George Washington had more influential power in America than anyone.
Yeah, it's no wonder, the more you talk, it's no wonder that we can't get beyond trying to figure out the legacy of slavery. That's what being Thomas Jefferson's all about. Fascinating conversation, Andy. And the more I think about it, actually, I mean, this endeavor of getting into Jefferson's heart and soul, his inner life, maybe what you're, and this is a final question because we've got to end. We've gone on a little long. I apologize. Maybe the best way to write about Jefferson is in fictional form rather than in nonfiction. You're a historian. You're obviously a nonfictional writer. But what you'll really be saying that the best way to understand Jefferson is through a novelist, a fine novelist who would write a book about being Thomas Jefferson.
I'll just say this to wrap up. I'm interested in the psychological elements in his social circle, in that political climate. And a professional historian can do that work. We have a fictionalization of Jefferson in novel form. It was done in the 19th century and it was done in the 20th century. Max Bird's Jefferson, he was a professor of English, since retired, who wrote a couple of these novels about the founders. Gore Vidal's Burr.
Right, I was thinking of Gore Vidal.
Yeah, so there's room for all of us, but clearly Americans need to understand their history beyond the compressed history that they get in high school textbooks. And Jefferson is an endlessly fascinating individual.
Right, I think that's what we can conclude, Andy. Yeah. We may not agree on everything, but the one thing we can we agree on is that Thomas Jefferson is certainly not dead, and being Thomas Jefferson means he's very much alive. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you.
I assume you've got another Thomas Jefferson book in the works.
No way. This is it.
You probably say that after every book on Jefferson you write. Anyway, congratulations, Andy, on the book. Fascinating conversation about perhaps the most fascinating figure in American history. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.